Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. My name is Juan Londoño and today's topic is simply if I could only buy one lens, what would it be? Oh my gosh. Yeah. Today's video is brought to you by nobody. It's sponsored by me. I figured I'd play around a little today. So one of these days we're going to be sponsored and we can do reviews because companies that sponsor you send you cool stuff to do reviews on. But right now it's just me. So everything that I do reviews on is usually mine. Who on earth is this video even good for? Well, or useful for? Well, anybody that gets a camera, and I know somebody, one of my students recently. I hope she watches this video because she'll know I'm talking about her. She got a beautiful camera. And sometimes we get these cameras and we may get a very simple lens. It might not even be the most useful lens, right? So the question becomes, if I really had one lens to walk around with, what would I buy for this camera? Maybe you want to buy a camera like this without a kit lens because you save money by not buying a kit lens, and you end up getting a lens that's really more practical for you, right? So then again, the question is, I have this beautiful camera I just bought without a lens. What's going to be my first lens, right? So it might not be the only lens you ever buy, period. But this theory of what lens would I buy if I could only buy one lens, you can certainly apply it early on in your photography career so that you make your investment wisely on your first lens. Another place that this concept of the one lens is very useful, obviously finances, right? You only have the money to buy one lens, but when you're taking a trip, and even though you have a collection of lenses, you want to just take one lens. Sometimes for very intelligent reasons, like you're hiking some pretty steep areas and you don't want the weight. The less you can carry, the better. The lighter the backpack, even the material of the backpack matters, right? So a really light backpack, the smallest camera you have, and the smallest lens. In this case, I would carry that M6 Mark II, which is a very small crop sensor, mirrorless camera with this little pancake lens, right? That would be perfect. I would make that work. If it's not as steep and crazy, maybe it would be that 16mm 1.4 because it's sharper, it's wider, right? But you know what I'm saying, right? This concept applies to people that want to take trips and can't carry the weight. Another one is you want to take a trip and you want to be more of a true photographer. You want to be in touch with yourself, with the photography, with the art, with your camera. And having 3 or 4 lenses, you're constantly switching back and forth. Ooh, I could use wider here. Ooh, I need a telephoto here. Ooh, and you spend half of your day switching lenses. If you want to be true to the art, true to photography, you want to spend less time doing that, then you want to carry one lens, right? Is it the nifty 50 with the eye sees? Is it the 35mm, the great street photography lens? Is it a 24mm because it's wider? That's up to you, okay? Is it a zoom lens that can cover all that range, like a 24 to 105? Beautiful. Just remember, it's bigger, it's heavier, right? But it is one lens. Of course, the other place where this concept is important is space. You are traveling and you have no space, right? You may be going somewhere where you can't carry a backpack It's basically what you have in your hand. Maybe a little fanny pack. You can carry a small lens in there, but most likely you're going to have a couple of batteries and memory cards, maybe a cleaner, right? Some wipes in case your lens gets dirty. Don't ever forget those. So this is what, photography, right? It depends on the person, what they're shooting, what they want, but you kind of see the concept here. What I'm going to do here is present what I think are the most versatile lenses, plural, and you'll understand why in a second. The most versatile lenses for 80% of the photographers, right? There are going to be those very special cases of people that buy a camera without a lens and they have a very specific task. They're shooting macro photography, I'm not talking about that. However, the reason I said lenses is because towards the end, if you stay till the end, I'm going to cover each genre of photography, at least the more popular ones like weddings and sports, right? And I'm going to talk about if you have a camera and you're getting into one of those genres, what is the most beneficial lens to own? Remembering, of course, that this is an opinion. We all have opinions. You know how that saying goes, right? Opinions are like buttholes. Each and every one of us has one. And of course, before we can even get into any of this, we have to talk about sensor sizes. For example, the camera filming right now, this video, is a crop sensor. It's a Canon crop sensor camera. So if I put a 100mm lens on that camera, it's going to act as a 160. I have to multiply by 1.6 for Canon, 1.5 for many of the other manufacturers, and others may have a different number, right? If I have a full frame sensor like my Canon 5D Mark III, it's a DSLR, it's a full frame sensor. That same 100mm lens, which I am actually talking about the same lens because I have adapters where I could use it on either camera. If I put that 100mm lens on a full frame sensor, then it's a 100mm lens. That's what it is. However, I have a Fujifilm GFX 100S, which is a large format. If I put my 100mm lens on that, it's actually a 79. I have to multiply by 0.79. So round it to 0.8, right? So it's an 80mm equivalent. What I'm talking about here, when I give you a number and I say the most practical lens in the world, just as an example, is a 50mm, you can't just buy a 50mm and put it on a crop sensor because that's going to act as a different number. That's going to act like as a 75, 77, whatever, right? And you can't put it on the large format because it's going to act as a 30-something, or 40. So when I say for this video, the most practical lens is a 50mm, you're going to have to convert to whatever sensor you have. So here we are. In the general category, which is for most people that buy a camera these days, what I call the all-purpose magical lens. Now, I was going to say 24-70 because that used to be very popular when sensors weren't that good and the ISO was kind of sketchy. 24-70 got you a 2.8 lens, which means you can open it very wide and let a lot of light in. If you went for the 24-105, then it was an f4 lens. Now it limited your light. But the truth is today the sensors are so good and you can get ISO up there to 3200 and 6400 most of the time with very little noise, that I am going to say that the most practical lens we can own today, if you just have one lens and you wanted to keep one lens on your camera, it's a 24mm to 105mm. I think Nikon does 24-100. Everybody does a little different, I forget, but just roughly a 24mm to 105mm, and in Canon's case it's an f4. But if you don't have the money for an f4, you can get a variable aperture, right, which is a little slower. So just keep that in mind, 24-105. Now, why this lens, right? Well, 24 millimeter equivalent, notice I say equivalent because on a full frame it's a 24, but on a crop sensor you have to do the multiplying, you have to get that 15 millimeter to be a 24 millimeter equivalent. So a 24 millimeter equivalent is wide enough that you can do landscapes, you can do street photography, you can walk around interiors and do interiors with a slight limitation, something like fell in my mouth, with a slight limitation. But you can do so much stuff. You can do environmental portraits where you get people in their environments, right? That's what that means. And you can do so much other stuff, you know, group pictures, right? And then you can zoom in from 24 all the way to 105. And 105, you're talking, you know, slight telephoto, right? Decent telephoto, wonderful portraits. Even if you get that f4 or even if it's higher than that, when you're at 105 or 100, it softens the background. That bokeh is wonderful. You can do a lot with that lens. And then of course you have any focal length in between, right? If you put an extension tube on that setup, you might even get some good macro photography. So there's a lot you can do with that lens. It's just a general all-purpose good lens. 35 falls into that category from 24 to 105. So 35 is considered one of the best street photography lenses. Not everybody likes it, but it's very popular. 50 millimeter is what the eye sees typically. So people want to put that on their camera and just not even move, you know, the 50 millimeter because they feel like they're getting what the eye sees. Well, you have that in that lens as well. You have the famous 85 millimeter, which is considered in a full frame format the best, you know, portrait lens, right? Not too close, not too far to your subject. So you just have that whole gamut. And then you have 100 millimeter, which is a wonderful telephoto if you want to do some closer, tighter portraits. So that covers basically that general purpose, all-inclusive lens that kind of does it all, okay? And, you know, not everybody's going to agree. Let me know in the comments what you think. By the way, quick water break for anybody that hasn't had your water, tea, coffee, beer, whatever it is you drink. Got to take that break. Keep healthy. So like I was saying, if you don't agree, you know, leave a comment below. But remember, when you're going to type in your comment, remember that I'm talking about a general all-purpose lens. Now, if you have an idea of what a better general all-purpose lens is, just let me know, and then other people can read that, right? And we can get some good ideas from you. So going into specific genres here, we're going to start with one of the most popular genres, which is weddings. And for weddings, I started with the 24-70 because it was a 2.8. And when you're indoors, you need that 2.8, especially back in the day, right? Now we can get away with so much more. So I'm going to go back to that 24 to 105. If you had to start weddings with just one lens, you can get away with a 24 to 105, right? Now it's going to be a little darker when you're indoors. You might have to tell the person from the, you know, that organized the event if they could just, sometimes they dim the lights a little too much, if they can just leave a little light on for you because it does help for focusing and for other things. And sometimes they're very cordial and they're willing to help, right? But you know, if you know that very soon you're going to buy, for example, a 70 to 200 2.8, which is the next lens you're going to need for weddings, then you might want to invest in the 24 to 70 2.8 because then you have the whole range. 24 to 70, 70 to 200, and they're both 2.8 lenses. So they're both very wide, very fast. You can let a lot of light in, and they're going to be perfect for weddings. The only thing that'll be missing is that really wide lens, which is typically a 15 to 35. There's an overlap there from that 15 to 35 and then the 24 to 70, but it's a very practical lens. They call those three lenses the holy trinity of lenses, right? So I never had that wide one. I had the 24 to 70 and the 70 to 200, and I did miracles with that. I did every wedding, never had a problem. Now remember, that's the full frame equivalent. 24 to 105 we're talking, right? Because I said I had a 24 to 70, but I'm recommending for you 24 to 105 first, right? Unless you know you're going to buy that 70 to 200. If you do, and you know that it's going to be in a few months or a couple of months, then get that 24 to 70 if you can. Sports, you know, you can get a prime, right? Many people have primes because they have a couple of different focal lengths. But if you had one lens to do sports, I would say like a 100 to 400 zoom or a 100 to 500, right? These are very versatile. and they go from, you know, you're not going to be able to take a picture of the entire team unless you get really far back. So that's going to be your limiting factor, but you can get a nifty 50 for 125 bucks to 200 bucks, and then you can do that. But now we're talking 2 lenses, right? But I'm just saying in case of an emergency. But if you really have one lens that you can only buy, or one lens you can only carry, then what's the deal here? For sports, definitely you're going to need a 400 or 500. You can buy an not an extension tube, a teleconverter, like a 1.4. I don't know if a 2-time teleconverter is a good idea because it does degrade the image quite a bit. So a 1.4, you attach that on that 400, you multiply 400 by 1.4, you get a wonderful, wonderful range, right? And the 100 has to be multiplied by 1.4 as well. Don't forget. So you start at 140 instead of 100, but then you go much higher. And if you have a 400 or 500, right? So 100 to 400 or 100 to 500. You know, if you don't spend a lot of money, it's going to be a slower lens, so you're going to have to jack up your ISO a little bit, right? Especially if you're in an indoor event. But these are going to be fantastic lenses. You're going to get close up on the athletes. If you have a high megapixel camera, like an R5, then you can crop and still have a wonderful image. And I'm talking about the Canon R5, right? Or any high megapixel camera, the Alpha 1, you know, there's so many of them now, right? The Nikon Z9 or Z9. The next category is bird photography, right? Aviary photography. So this is a very unique type of photography, and you would think that probably having a zoom lens is an advantage, kind of like sports, right? But most of the time, you're going to be pretty far away from those birds because they get freaked out very quickly. So if you have, say, a 100 to 400, you're going to find yourself at 400 all of the time, right? At least from experience. And I don't do a lot of bird photography. I've done some, but I have friends that do it passionately, right? And they're just going with prime lenses now. So hence my recommendation here is going to be a prime lens, right? For birds, I'm thinking a 400 millimeter prime. Canon has a very affordable 800 and 1000 millimeter, but they're slower apertures. So they're going to block a lot of light. If you're doing something like hummingbirds or birds that move very quickly and you want to be really sharp and crisp and stop the action, you're going to have trouble getting to like a 2,000th of a second with a lens that's very closed because it doesn't let light in to begin with. And then when you put it at that shutter speed, like 2,000th of a second, you're going to block even more light, right? So your ISO is going to be ridiculously high and you're going to get a lot of grain, which you see in a lot of bird photography. Many times because birds are in the shadows, in the shade, under a tree branch, right? Sometimes you can't help but catch them on a rainy or cloudy day and you have to take the picture. So you can't go too slow. Even if you don't want to be at 2,000th of a second, you still need to be at about, you know, if the bird is still on the branch, you can still, with a 400 millimeter lens, you're still going to have to be at least like a 6/40th of a second or something like that if you want some sharpness. So it still blocks a lot of light, right? So if your lens only opens to 5.6 or 6.3 or even 8 or 11, woo, you're blocking a lot of light, right? So if you can afford something like a 400 millimeter f4, right? But we start getting into some pretty pricey lenses here. So the other option, if you can just afford one lens, now I say prime because you want that sharpness, and prime lenses are the sharpest. They have less elements, there are less moving parts, right? But there is a workaround, which is many different companies have like a 150 to 600 or a 60 to 600. In Sigma's case, I own that lens, the 60 to 600. It's an incredible lens. Is it the sharpest in the world? A prime's going to beat it. I mean, let's not even argue that, right? But I find anywhere from 150 to 600, the thing is super sharp. And I've never had a problem with it, right? Of course, I'm not comparing it with a prime all the time because I don't own a prime in the 500, 600 range. So I can't compare it. But I'm really happy with it. I take pictures of airplanes. I do all kinds of stuff, right? Squirrels. And I'll try to post some of that here. But That's basically it for bird photography. You want probably a prime 400 or 500 if you can. Anything you can afford. If you have to buy it secondhand, make sure it's good quality. Get it from a reputable source that's not gonna sell you something broken. You know, you can buy it on eBay, but you're really taking a chance. Places like, I forget, is it MPB and KEH? These guys sell stuff that's backed by them, it's repaired by them, it's warranted by them. So keep that in mind. Now we're into the category of portraits. So portraits used to be, as I mentioned before in this video, it used to be the 85 millimeter, and people started doing the 85 millimeter 1.8 and the 1.4. Then Canon comes out with a 1.2 that blew the world away because it was such a good lens, and everybody else made one, and they're all pretty decent, right? Because they're all expensive and they're good glass. Personally, I shoot fashion, I shoot models. I like to give them space to work, right? To move around and to feel comfortable away from the photographer. I get a lot more out of a 100. So I have a 100 millimeter 2.8 that I use all the time for portraits. I'm going to post a couple of pictures here, but at the end of the video, so stick around. And I'll label it so you know which lens it is. So you say, but Juan, it's a 100 millimeter 2.8. It's not as good as a 1.2. Well, first of all, it's not the L series. It's the regular 100 millimeter 2.8. So it cost me like 800 bucks. Okay. I know you say, ooh, that's a lot of money. Well, the L series, the new one, is 1,200. So what I'm trying to say is it's not as expensive as that one. It's still 2.8. They're both 2.8. But I get amazing bokeh at 100 millimeters, right? If I'm going to shoot it at 100, it's a prime. I have no choice. The bokeh is beautiful. So the 85, the bokeh 2.8 is not going to be as good because it's wider. So you're going to need a 2.0, right, to give you that same bokeh as that 100 2.8. Of course, it gives you 1.2, that 85 millimeter, right? So you get beautiful soft bokeh. But I find myself a little too close to the subject. Now, yes, you can stay further back and you can take like, you know, not full body, but, you know, 3/4, right? And then you can crop on your computer, but I'm trying not to crop. I'm trying to get the full resolution. So for me, the 100 millimeter 2.8, if you have one lens to buy, if you have a Canon R5 or R6 and you want to do portraits and you don't want to spend all that money, like $3,000 on an 85 millimeter 1.2, get a 100 millimeter 2.8. It's a beautiful lens. It's much more affordable. Even at $1,200, it's not $3,000, right? If you get a used one, you'll pay $1,000. And if you get an EF mount with a converter, it's still going to be a wonderful lens. And then you get it for under 800 bucks because they don't make that lens anymore. Now, if you're shooting groups, when I say portraits, sometimes you're just restricted. You end up doing a lot of families. Now, you become the person that ends up doing family portraits, and you get called to everybody's house to do family portraits, and you set up the backdrops or you shoot them in a natural environment in their home. That 85 and the 100, it's going to be too restrictive, right? You're not going to be wide enough. So at that point, I'm going to say either stick with a nifty 50 1.8, the 50 millimeter, right? If you need something wider, maybe a 35 millimeter 1.4. That's a beautiful lens. Or, and I'm just giving you options here, right? Or I wrote down here back to the 24 to 105, right? F4. That's a beautiful lens. And again, if you need it for portrait of a one person and you put it at 100 to 105, that 4.0 is still going to give you a nice bokeh. Okay. When you're doing the whole family thing, bokeh kind of goes to heck because you have to, you know, the wide angle is just going to kill bokeh a lot. So, and you're going to need, in order for everybody to be focused, operating it at f2 or f2.8 or f4 is not practical. You're going to need to be like at f5.6 or f8 so that everybody is clearly focused. And at that case, your background is completely exposed. So don't worry about that. But to sum it up, I go back. Portraits, 100 millimeter 2.8 is my favorite. Macro photography. So most camera manufacturers will make a 50 millimeter macro and a 100 millimeter macro. At least Canon does, right? They give you that choice. If you buy the 50 millimeter macro, there's nothing wrong with that lens. And the nice thing about it is that it's a 50. So it sees what the eye sees. You can use it for very natural street photography, environmental portraits. You can do so much with that lens. Yes, like any other prime, it's going to be limiting. You can't do telephotos, you can't do really wide stuff, right? But it's a macro. So if you need to shoot small things like flowers up close and stuff like that, it's going to be really nice. Now, what's the difference between the 50 and the 100? The 100 is going to bring things up even closer, okay? So if you're into, and you know you're into, insects, flowers, you know, all kinds of bugs, you know, getting a spider web with the spider on it and stuff like that. I love stuff like that, right? Raindrops. I mean, if you're getting to that point, then you're going to need the 100. Not only will you need the 100, but you may have to put an extension tube on that thing, right? To get you up a little closer. So my recommendation, if you're going to do macro photography and you know you're going to do flowers and big insects, or small toys and things like that, right? Small products, rings, watches, and you want to get up close, I would say definitely the 100 millimeter 2.8 gives you more versatility. Can you step back? Of course you can, right? If you don't need that level of macro, you can still move it back a little. And you don't have to shoot it at 2.8, remember that. When you're shooting macro, you want to go up a little higher because your depth of field is going to be shot. So if you're shooting a watch, for example, you're going to focus on the 12, and the 6 o'clock is going to be blurry at 2.8. So you may have to put it at 5.6 or even 8 when you get that close, and you get a little better focus, okay? And you want to focus something in the middle of the watch so everything around it is focused. If you focus on that 12, that 6 is all the way at the other extreme, closer to you, and it's going to be blurry. If you focus on the 6, the 12 is too far from you and it's very blurry. But if you focus on that center dial and you put it on f8, for example, the 12 will be sharp and the 6 will be sharp, okay? So use some strategies that will help you. But overall, macro photography, my favorite is, again, that 100 millimeter macro, the same that I was using for portraits, because I'm not going to buy 2 lenses for portraits and macro when I can use 1 lens for both, right? Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I hate using that because I wouldn't kill a bird, but maybe, I don't know, find out another saying. There's got to be something kind. If you know it, put it in the comments so I can use it going forward. And we'll end this genre thing with street photography. I love, love, love street photography. We can debate this probably for an hour. People will tell you, I can't stand 35 millimeter. It sucks. It's too restrictive. I like 24. I'll even do 15 in my street photography. I've gone out with the camera that's shooting this video, which is a crop sensor, and I have an 11 to 22, which the equivalent ends up being like a 15 to 35, just roughly, okay? And I'll be honest with you, many times I need that 15 millimeter, right? But there are times it's annoying. I don't need all that. It's busy. It's too busy. There's too much information. I need something like it's a 15 to 35, so I end up using it at the 35. Now, when I use that kit lens, the 15 to 45, it's the equivalent in the full frame as a 24 to 70, that ideal lens we talked about, right? That one stays on my camera most of the time, even though it's a kit lens. It's a 15 to 45 on a crop sensor. So the equivalent full frame is 24 to 70. And I love that because it's 24, it's wider than the 35. So if you dislike the 35, this is a little wider, and you can go all the way to 70 if you need to get close to a person, if you got somebody doing something interesting, lighting a cigarette, whatever, right? Opening the car, and you want to get a little closer without being in their face, then you put it up to 70. You kind of discreetly put the camera at your waist and you shoot them, and you can get some really cool things that way, right? So for street photography, so we're back to this, you know, we never really got to what lens, right? I started by saying people hate the 35. Some people love it. Some people hate the 24, it's too wide. Some people love it. Some people say they won't shoot street photography with anything other than a 50 because it's what the eye sees. So the best thing to do is give yourself a range, right? I think the 24 to 70 is a good range. If you need the 24 to 105 because you already bought it, right, for other things, then use that for your street photography. Remember one thing though, street photography needs to be discreet. You don't want to be shooting people with a huge camera and lens because they're going to be uncomfortable and they're going to confront you. They're going to come over and say, did you just take a picture of me? Trust me, it happens, okay? So what you want to do is you want to have a small camera, right, like a mirrorless crop sensor. And this is why many people use these, right? Like Fujifilm is like the king, and Leicas are the king of street photography because many of them are crop sensor and they are very small lenses, small footprint for the camera. Leica, of course, has full frame as well. Fuji doesn't do full frame, but they do the medium form, the large format, right? So you can use that, but again, it's a bigger camera. It looks like a DSLR, right? It looks like this thing. So when you're doing street photography, you want a small lens, right? Ideally, if you can get comfortable with a prime, you're gonna get the sharpest images. I have, for this M6 Mark II, this Canon, I have a 22mm pancake. It's a tiny little lens, right? Actually, let me show you. Bam! This is it. Now remember, this has a cap. So you take this off and you take this off and I have a filter on it. So it's actually smaller than with all these caps, right? It's a very flat lens. It's a 22mm f2. So if you go to full frame equivalent, it's about a 35mm. And f2 becomes like a f2.6 or something like that, right? So, because you multiply that by 1.62. But it's a wonderful lens. So I learned to live with that lens on my camera, and it's an f2. For shady areas, and I don't mean shady in terms of the people, I mean shady in terms of the trees and the shade, right? For shady areas, or shaded areas, I should be clear, the shaded areas, or when the sun starts going down, that's a wonderful, wonderful lens, right? But you got to get used to that. It's a 22, it's a 35mm equivalent, right? Like I said, some people are going to say, that's not wide enough, Juan, I can't do it. So in that case, I keep that 11 to 22, which is a 15 to 35 or 16 to 35 equivalent, something like that. But it's a slower aperture, right? It's like a 3.5 to 6.3 or 4 to 6.3. So automatically it kills me. Now, if you're comfortable with a prime here, I have a Sigma 16mm 1.4. Now, when you multiply that by 1.5 to get or 1.6 to get that 35mm equivalent, you end up with like a 24mm, 25mm. That 1.4 becomes like a 1.8 or something like that, right? Still, or f2, is still an amazing lens. That is wider than this 22. It's a 16, right? So the equivalent, instead of this 22 is a 35mm equivalent, that 16 is like a 24mm equivalent. So that is a 24mm equivalent, and the f-stop equivalent of 1.4 and 35mm ends up being like a 1.8, 2.0. So that lens is awesome. Sometimes it's a little too wide, but if I only have one lens, I don't want to carry anything else, that's the lens I'm going to carry, because I can get into the evening and I have that 1.4, right? It opens up to 1.4, which again, equivalent 35 is a 1.8 or 2.0, right? But a lot of flexibility here, right? So again, if you are that photographer that needs more range, then you want to carry a zoom. If you want sharpness and you like wide, then get yourself a 15mm or remember, full frame, right? A 15mm or a 24mm. That's going to be wonderful for street photography. And I'll just end by saying, if you're doing street portraits, people in the environment, environmental portraits, then something a little closer, right? I would say no more. I mean, people will argue that their 24mm is perfect, but more people are going to tell you that the 35 is ideal, 35 or 50. The 50, you can get the person and you can get stuff around them. The 35, you get a little more stuff around them, right? If you want more of the person, you need to come up closer, okay? So that's basically it. Those are the genres, but I gave you that overall at the beginning. It's that, you know, the general purpose lens is really that 24 to 105. Keep in mind, if you're traveling, don't ever forget, we've covered this in videos, study the city where you're going. Some cities are dangerous, and a small camera like my Canon M6 Mark II, or for example, the Fujifilm X100V, right? Or X100 anything. Any small camera like that is going to be wonderful with a small prime, right? Or a small zoom, like my kit, 15 to 45 is the equivalent of a 24 to 70, right? That's a wonderful lens. It's not much bigger than this, and it doesn't look, you know, offensive, and people will consider you an amateur, and you can take beautiful pictures. A little tripod that you can fit in a bag, nothing too big where you're drawing attention. So please study the place where you're going and make sure you adequately pack for that, so that you don't have this big expensive camera with a bunch of lenses. So we are done with this video. I'm going to put some pictures up like I promised. with the different lenses so you can see what they do, especially those specialty lenses like those really big zoom lenses and some of the primes. I leave you with this. I hope it was helpful. Please like, subscribe, comment if you can. I love when you comment, and share it with a friend. I absolutely love you guys, and I love being here with you. Please, please, please take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next video. Ciao for now. Let's do this. Let's do this. With gum in my mouth and everything. Little lipstick. We're ready to go here. Okay.